The Fender 57 Champ. I know the big question on a lot of people's minds is, will you actually use it? Hey everyone, welcome to this one-year review of the Fender 57 Champ. I got this almost exactly a year ago now, and so I've obviously had some time to reflect on it, play with it more, and give you a whole year's worth of feedback regarding whether or not this is something you should think about getting, because it's a really interesting amp. It's known for tons of classic tones, but being a small 5-watt amp with an 8-inch speaker, it's obviously pretty limited in its functionality. So many of you are going to be wondering, geez, is this something worth buying? Particularly because they're not inexpensive. So my experience with this amp has been kind of in the middle, and I want to say in advance, you might come out of this video being more confused than you were before. Let me dive in further. The thing about these amps is a lot of people talk about them being a one-trick pony. They're not a one-trick pony, but they're not versatile either. They're kind of in the middle. They do more than just the typical champ sound that everyone pictures them for, but they don't do a lot, and they are still limited. The big thing with them is the price tag, because they're not cheap. As far as overpriced go, I've seen a lot of people use the term overpriced. Nowadays, that's really hard to determine, because comparatively to other amps out there of its ilk, I don't know that it is overpriced. I know that it's expensive and it's on the higher end price-wise, but comparatively to other hand-wired US-made tube amps, I mean, you look at like the Vox hand-wired AC4 that's made in China, and it's not really, it's got the master volume, and it's not really the direct kind of reproduction. That one's almost as expensive, and then you look at small 5-watt hand-wired amps from boutique companies, and they're quite a bit more expensive. So The thing is a lot of stuff is just really expensive nowadays. So being overpriced I don't want to really go down that road, but it is a lot of money for an amp that many of you are wondering whether or not you'd actually use. Here's the trouble with it. The trouble with it is you need to just love the Champ tone, because whether you're running it clean or overdriven, it does kind of have a sound. You need to love that enough that you need to be willing to work with it in order to get it going in different applications and things. Now, what you just heard was recording it like it was a studio track, and so I added some studio effects to it so that you can hear how it might sound in a recording context, because that's probably the biggest use for this amp, honestly, is for home studios, pro studios, but something where you can get the whole range of sound and you don't need to worry about how loud it is. And you know, that was the classic Champ thing. It was using them in studios because they didn't want to be blasting these giant Marshalls and just peeling paint off the walls all the time. What do? Get a small tube amp, still get a nice drive tone that you can do reasonably in-house, and that's where so many classic tones came from. You know, James Gang, the one for me is Eric Clapton. I love, you know, Eric Clapton, particularly in the 1970s. He had some really great tones, and a lot of those were Champ tones. But again, in order to shell out that kind of money, you need to really love that sound. So what you heard when I was doing that was you heard the three main sounds that I think this amp does and does well. That's clean, edge of breakup, and then full out overdrive. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about my amp a little bit specifically, because it is slightly different than the one that you would be buying if you're buying it like from Sweetwater. See, mine, the speaker blew, and this is actually something that it was going right when I got it. I just didn't notice. It was very subtle. In fact, some of you pointed out there were a couple of places where it sort of reared its ugly head in my original video of this amplifier, where you could hear just a little bit of speaker distortion that I unfortunately missed when I was editing the video. That got worse over time, and I went through some speaker swaps and wound up with a Jupiter Alnico speaker, which I think sounds phenomenal, and I actually think sounds superior to the original speaker anyway. The original speaker is not a bad speaker, but the Jupiter Alnico just sounds phenomenal. The other thing, and this is a common mod for them, is the stock ones come with a 12A something 7. It's not a 12AX7. It's AU7 or AT7 or something. I think it's an AU7. AY7? It's something. I switched it to the AX7, and the reason is because it gives it a little more gain, a little more output, and gets you a little closer to some of the classic Champ tones that I associated with. Now, apparently, that's even in the manual. I got mine used, so I didn't get the manual. Had I had the manual, I wouldn't have read it anyway, so it's a moot point. Let's move on. Mine has the 12AX7 and it has a Jupiter speaker, so it's going to be a little bit fuller sounding, drive a little harder, but it's still the same amp, and it's still giving you the same tones that, you know, and also pretty easy mods for those of you who are getting it. Another common thing is that many of you have talked about the DIY, the do-it-yourself kits that are out there. Those are actually still pretty expensive and do require you to be able to wire yourself, which would be a lot of fun. I'd actually really like to do that sometime, but for many players, that's probably off their radar. So yeah, I think that's worth it if you know how to do it. That's a really cool option, but that's not really a great option for everyone. Used, they are pretty reasonably priced. You just got to keep your eyes open for the right one. But it all comes back to that whole, how much are you going to use it? Live use, it's, you know, I used it for a gig last year in a small trio, and it worked really, really well, and I had a good time using it. I actually didn't have to turn it up that loud in the small trio setting in kind of a small gig. In a larger gig, I mean, you can take anything if you're going to be mic'd up, but honestly, you also probably want an amplifier that's going to push a little more air. I know that when I'm playing in a big band setting, I like an amp that not only is going through the PA, but that I can hear the actual amp when I'm on stage. I played a show last year where my amp was really quiet on stage and was entirely going through the PA, and that actually kind of threw me. I like having that pushback from the actual amp itself, and then, you know, mixed with the PA tones. This one's not going to push that much sound, so the actual sound of the amp will get lost on stage, and then you have to rely entirely on monitors and the PA system. That being said, it is doable. You know, you certainly can. again, it keeps going back to how much do you want that tone. Now, I talked about the three sounds a little bit, the clean, the edge of breakup, and the overdrive. Now, the clean, this is one that I talked about in my original video that I didn't get at first with the other tube in there, but with the 12AX7 I totally get. This is the Jason Isbell Cobb sound. This was talked about in the 5-Watt World video, and there was a Premier Guitar Rig rundown that talks about it, but the studio idea was that you never run a Champ past 3 on the volume knob, which is really quiet, but the idea is that you get this just beautiful, it's full, but it's clean, and when you mic it up and get the volume up, it sounds really, really good on a recording. It sort of like doesn't even really need to be EQ'd or anything. It just sounds great. It just sounds like how you want it to sound. So that was that first clean tone that you were hearing. Now we're going to hear all these tones again unaffected by studio stuff, right? So you just heard it mixed in, including some actual double tracking where I did real double tracking, not like an auto double tracker or anything. You heard that as if it would be, what it would sound like if you were to use this in the studio, and then how it might sound on a finished product. Now I'm going to give you just the tone of the amp without some of the extra stuff added on. So you're going to hear that clean tone. So it's in the high gain input and the volume is right at 3. Now for that edge of breakup tone, one of my favorite tones with this amp is to use the low gain input and then turn it up to about 6. Now with the stock tube, that was actually pretty clean, but with the 12AX7, it gives me a little edge of breakup. So if you have the stock tube in it and the stock speaker, maybe push it a little higher up to like 8, or go to 6 but put it into the high gain input. So those are your kind of options there. Now, so I'm using the Stratocaster for the clean tone, the Telecaster for the edge of breakup tone, and then we are going to go all out with the Les Paul, and the Les Paul going into the high gain input with it totally opened up. And even with the 12AX7 in the room, it's not that loud. It's not unpleasantly loud. It's not something that makes you like, I can only do this for a minute. No, you can see why these were popular for studio use. And with the Les Paul in particular, it almost has like a fuzz tone. It has that classic tweed tone that's actually sort of similar to like, I've always thought that a crank tweed amp sounds similar to like, almost like a fuzz face. That's kind of the tone that you get from it. Now, these are surprisingly good pedal platforms. I did a whole video on that, which I'm going to link to right there. And I also made an HX Stomp preset that kind of helps cure some of the little ills, like if you want to tame the sort of lower mid-rangey thing that these do. There's an EQ in there and some other stuff. So if you're interested in that, you can find that on my website, which I will link below if you're an HX Stomp user and a Champ user. Really narrow demographic there, but I'm going for it, man. So in a minute here, we're going to get back to those 3 different tones so that you can hear them unaffected by the extra studio bits that we were doing there. As far as me personally goes, I really like having this amp. If you're looking for like one amp to have, this is not it. You probably want something more versatile with more wattage that you can use in more applications. If you're somebody kind of coming from a digital world, thinking about getting into tube amps, or this is a great amp, but I think it's still kind of a specialized thing. I think mostly you're going to want it for studio use. You have to really want that tone. And yeah, there are options where you can use this live, but I certainly wouldn't say like, get this because it's a great live amp. I'd say, no, you can make it work live if you want to. Now, kind of going back to what I've been saying, which is you really have to want that tone. The thing about it is if you want that tone, this does it, and there's really not a lot else that does it. There are some other things you can do, like I've talked about with a Princeton and even with a Blues Junior, where if you like really cut a bunch of the EQ and sort of drive it and maybe work with your tone on your guitar a little bit, you can kind of get these old small studio box tones from them. But when you really plug into a cranked Champ, and even just doing like the clean Champ, it does its thing, and it does it better than anything else trying to mimic it. So if you really do like that tone, it's the ticket. This just works. It just sounds amazing. So let's get back into those tones. Please let us know in the comments. Do you have this amp? Do you have one of the do-it-yourself kits? What do you think? Is this something that you would think about? Something you definitely want? Something that's a hard pass? Let us know. I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video.